Hey there, welcome to the Art of Healing. I'm your host, Julia Tilley, and today's episode is going to be just a little bit different. Our guest today is David Schultz. We had an amazing conversation today about mental illness such as schizophrenia, PTSD, and bipolar. We also brushed on addiction and focused a lot on abuse, especially the cycle of abuse. This was a very interesting conversation, and I'm sure you will all enjoy it and learn a whole lot, just like I did. So please stick around for the rest of the show and make sure to like and rate it at the end of the show. Have a great day and enjoy! Welcome our guest today, David Schultz. He is a probation worker and he is going to be speaking with us about mental health disorders, abuse, and addiction. Thank you for joining our show. It's nice to have you here today.
Thank you.
So what would you like to start off with? I know we got a lot of stuff to discuss here. What is your favorite thing to talk about?
Well, one of my favorite topics is psychopathy. I'm a bachelor holder in psych. I'm going to seek out a master's here soon for abnormal specifically. A lot of my projects and a lot of my research in college was based around dopamine disorders. So, like depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, stuff like that. We could start there. I think the bulk of my notes are on the cycles of abuse. So however you want to start it.
Let's start off with the psychopathy, because I know that some of those disorders can lead to abuse when they're not treated. So I think that'd be good that we could kind of work our way through that and addiction, and then we can kind of go into how those things lead into abuse, and then go over the cycle of abuse. I think that.
Yeah. I think the easiest way to link them, we'll take bipolar disorder, right? Type 1 and type 2, both of them are dopamine related disorders, and they have severe components to them that can trigger into abuse. So the difference between type 1 and type 2 is the manic episodes. Type 1 only has manic. Type 2 has what's called hypermanic. So they are really, really high, but they're very short in between, right? Now, that's not to say every case. Some of them can actually be longer cyclers, but, with type 1, a lot of people you see atypically, people who have type 1 bipolar disorder, when they hit those manic episodes, they are really good workers. They're very dedicated to what they're doing. They're almost obsessed. Some people could see it as obsessive compulsive disorder because they're so driven in what they're doing. I've noticed this when I used to work at a mental health facility, that those people, they would be singularly focused on one thing, and it would disrupt eating, sleeping, bathing, simple functions in life. And then once they come down, from that high, and they start entering that depression, that's when they start looking for that pickup pretty quick, because, the human body doesn't like to be in that depression cycle. And that's when drug abuse could come into play. Some people could use like methamphetamine to keep them up, keep them perked up out of that depressive state. Some people could use heroin when they're in the highs, because they just feel like they're just all over the place and they just need to calm down. Type 2, you can see people with type 2 doing the same thing, but the issue is that could also lead to abuse, because people who are hypermanic, they could develop almost insatiable craving for sexual activity, and that could cause the person to be promiscuous. It could cause cheating, and of course that can feed into abuse. They could, even not to say this is universal, but if it was bad enough, it could lead to sexual abuse of a partner. I haven't really seen cases like that, but I mean, the possibilities there.
Yeah, thank God you haven't seen too many. But I understand that because I'm bipolar myself, so I definitely have a lot of those highs and lows, and it
Mhm.
does get really hard when you go from being way up here and then you dip way down into that depression stage. But um, medication and therapy definitely help with a lot of that. So I would recommend to anyone that has any of these disorders, talk to somebody about it, talk to a counselor, a therapist, and see if you need medication because it can definitely help a whole hell of a lot.
Yeah. Well, and here's the thing is even with medication, you never really break those highs and lows.
Exactly.
It's more of limiting them, bringing them to where they're not so severe high, not so severe low. And that's what a misconception with a lot of people is they think, oh, the medication is just going to stop it. It never really stops.
It does.
You still see it in people, but it's not as bad. They're not doing a 3 days straight of work and then crashing for a day or two. And they're not suffering from so severe depression that they don't even get out of bed for those 2 days. You know what I mean? So it helps. I would absolutely recommend going and getting that treatment because it really brings you back into focus. Um, yeah, and like I said, with the highs and lows, you see a lot of people who have like schizophrenia or bipolar suffering from addiction too. They almost like a symbiotic union. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? Because you can see a lot of guys. We had a lot of guys that had TBI and like schizophrenia and bipolar. They would walk up to the local liquor store, slam a 6 pack, and drive back, or walk back. Why do you do that? I don't know. I just felt like doing it.
Hmm.
So you can see how that can get out of hand pretty quickly.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. My abuser was actually he had drug induced paranoid schizophrenia.
Yeah.
And that was from Adderall use, which was prescribed, but not using it the way it was supposed to be prescribed. And um, later on, then it was drugs like meth and crack and stuff like that. But it definitely it can lead to some pretty scary things. I mean, I didn't understand at all what schizophrenia was. I mean, I knew it, but you don't really understand it when you see it unless you know that's what it is because it's so erratic and they're not seeing and hearing the same things that you are.
Right. And mixing those substances with that kind of condition, you're talking about full blown psychosis. A lot of people that do that abuse drugs and alcohol while they're schizophrenic, especially when they're in these volatile states, they completely disconnect from reality. And let me ask you, did you ever notice something was off when did he have like this schizophrenia talk? Have you ever heard of that slang term used before?
Explain that to me a little bit.
So schizophrenia talk, usually schizophrenia with their thought patterns, it's very disjointed, right? Especially when they're in these phases. And we had one, this is the best way to describe it for you. He came into my office, was talking to me, and he goes, "Hey, David, I was sitting outside having a cigarette. Man, it looks like it's going to snow out there. And, it snows a lot up in Wisconsin where my family's from. And I just love elk hunting. That's how it would go." He would
Hmm.
pick one specific piece of that conversation and it would create another conversation within that time frame.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I definitely experienced that being around him, and a lot of that would come with the anger too. It would be
Mm-hmm.
like, this is what's going on and I see this happening, but look at this over here. And I mean, it would switch from looking to my phone to looking at me and saying, "Oh, I see you have bruises. Where did those come from?" And,
Right.
it would just switch back and forth so quickly. And, when you don't know what's going on, it just, it seems like you're being pounded with a million questions and you don't really
Right.
understand as to why. but that makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, usually that's what they say is like when somebody's full-blown schizophrenic, that is the way to tell. Especially if they're not exhibiting any outward symptoms, they will have those weird speech patterns. And it isn't with every case, but it's easy to tell when you've been in the environment with somebody who is schizophrenic, diagnosed with schizophrenia, and you hear it, and you put, oh, that talk is that schizophrenic chatter, that weird disjointed chatter. You never forget it, so you hear it in a lot of people in a lot of places. Some of it could be like ADHD. People who have ADHD have that real disjointed. So you instantly like on edge because you're like, okay, this person may be schizophrenic, and you've got to treat people who are unmedicated that are schizophrenic very differently from any other mental disorder, because going into that conversation, you have to know what you're going to talk about. So if you have a schizophrenic patient who is not taking their medication and is resistant to care, you need to go in going, okay, I'm not going to try to lie to them because they're already paranoid. They're going to sniff you out pretty quickly. And that was the thing that I learned in my first week. I went to talk to this guy who's got schizophrenia. And he also has a traumatic brain injury. So he's very impulsive. I didn't put those together. Being fresh out of college, I'm like, okay, I can just talk to this guy. It's going to be a normal conversation, And I went into it with ulterior motives. He sniffed me out pretty quick, and I wound up wearing a cherry Coke over it because he's like, you're effing lying to me. You're trying to manipulate me. You're just like everybody else. You're part of the government. And he threw a soda at me. They'll sniff you out. So if ever you have somebody in your life or you're around somebody that you know is schizophrenic, piece of advice, don't go with ulterior motives because they're already paranoid. So you're going to lose all respect with that person, and you're going to possibly elevate, those symptoms where they're going to be even more paranoid, angry, especially in an intimate partner sense, that could easily lead to abuse, very easily. So that's one thing that I learned pretty quick.
Yeah. I know one of the scary parts about my abuse was that he would, the fact that he was hearing and seeing things that weren't there. And I didn't understand it. Like, he would grab my phone and he would look at my maps and he would say, oh, it shows you going to this place, or it shows you going to this hotel, or whatever. And it would show nothing of the sort. And I would think, like, okay, maybe he's just, making things up, or he's just looking at it too quick and not paying attention. Or, he'd look at our security system outside and say, I see somebody walking around the house, or I see somebody in our car. And I knew that was some type of paranoia, but I didn't understand that he was actually seeing and hearing things that weren't there. So it's definitely something that if you don't know what's going on, and you're not somebody in your position, it would be hard for you to know that's exactly what it is.
Well, and that's the thing is, if ever you suspect something's not right with somebody close to you, I tell people all the time, the internet is a powerful tool. The DSM, you could easily look up the diagnostic criteria online very easily, and you can learn. There's 1,000 different podcasts, with licensed psychologists who know what they're talking about that you can learn. You have to be able to build that understanding, especially if you're at risk for that person becoming abusive or becoming even dangerous to themselves. It's not that hard to actually look into what you can do. A lot of people don't even know that, for instance, me and my wife, if I suspected she was having a psychotic break and she was a danger to herself, I could easily contact my local hospital and have her involuntary committed. A lot of people don't know you can do that. You can do that with your kids, because the world is recognizing, especially the world of healthcare now more than ever, is recognizing that these disorders are a serious thing that have to be looked into, and the people have to be protected from themselves sometimes.
Oh yeah.
Now, I'm not a huge fan of involuntary commitment, because doing that can cause a whole slew of problems down the road. So it's kind of like last resort. But it's there if you need it. It's always something to use if necessary.
Mhm. Yeah, that's very good advice. I know that's probably something I should have done, but when you're in that cycle of abuse, which we will get into later, it's kind of hard to make some decisions for yourself, especially when it has to do with the other person.
Oh,
But it's
absolutely.
very good advice.
Yeah, and especially with somebody who's psychotic and paranoid, if you a lot of people always kind of do the victim blaming game of, oh, well, you could have or you should have in that situation. You don't really know what a psychotic person is going to do, especially somebody who has paranoia. They could go from, thinking you're a 10-foot tall Jesus, for instance, and treating you like a goddess. And the next thing you know, they're turning around going, oh, no, 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 you're the devil in disguise. With that constant change, that it almost feels like classic criminal psychology, the psychology of interrogation, because there's so much pressure put onto you that your decision making isn't clear. So I hate when people like retrospectively look at criminal cases, for instance, like Jodi Arias or Lorena Bobbitt or stuff like that. Lorena Bobbitt's probably a good instance. She was under so much psychological abuse, that when she finally snapped and realized what she did, yeah, it was pretty bad, but she didn't think clearly in that situation. You know what I mean? Um, what was the one I was watching an interrogation of a guy who killed a young lady, and he was so obsessed with her that he wasn't thinking clearly. So you can see how obsession can even feed that psychological pressure where you don't even think right. You know, how many people in our lives do you know that has been in an abusive relationship and they stayed there from, maybe Stockholm syndrome to just that they think that they can fix the person.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of people nowadays, especially the younger crowd, and I say that like I'm a boomer or something, but the younger crowd, they think they can fix everything, they can fix everybody, and they need to learn that you can't fix everybody. Sometimes they need to fix themselves.
Mhm.
You know, so there's a lot of resources out there and a lot of information in the world.
There you go. Very good advice. Very good advice. So, um, let's get a little bit into addiction now that we've kind of gone over some of these health disorders, mental health disorders. Um, how does addiction connect with some of these mental health disorders? I know you kind of brushed on it earlier, but we'll go a little bit deeper than that.
Well, yeah, a lot of people who have psychological disorders, they will use to kind of bring normality to their life, even though it's not really normal. You know what I mean? Some children that were abused are actually statistically more likely to be users themselves later in life, and that has to do a lot with childhood trauma. You could, there's a guy that I know who is in my life who was in a really bad motorcycle accident when he was a teenager, and he was pronounced clinically dead, and he suffers from mental health issues, and there was some substance abuse disorder that added in there. You see it a lot with people who have these mental scars that they don't really deal with, slip into it. Look at one of my favorite cases to visit is the case of Nikki Sixx, the bassist for Motley Crue. He was a heroin addict for years, killed him twice, and a lot of that stemmed from his relationship with his mother. His mother was very out there. If you've heard him talk about her, if you read his book, he talks about how she was just so neglectful as parents. She was very mentally abusive to him when he was younger. Then he gets older, and he has these cycles of addiction because he's lost his grandmother, who he's probably considered as his mother. He's doesn't know his dad. His mom's whacked out, so he goes through these cycles of drug abuse, and then he gets clean, and then he goes through drug abuse again. He used it, one, to deal with the pain but two, also to kind of deal with the pressure of being famous. You have a million eyes on you every day. Everything you do is scrutinized, especially like look at now. Elon Musk buys a couple percents of Twitter and everybody freaks out. You know what I'm saying? So he was dealing with that pressure and that fed into his addiction. Now bringing it down to people like us, people that we're just trying to get through our day-to-day function. Some people do it as a party animal. Oh, we're at the club, I need to do some coke in the bathroom, and they think that brings them up. Some people, even in white collar situations, will use like cocaine and meth as uppers to keep them working, keep them productive. I mean, you don't see a lot of high functioning addicts in the world, but they're there. Sometimes they're there and you don't even know them. You could pass them on the street and they're probably high as a kite. Some people just do it to relax themselves. A lot of marijuana users nowadays talk about how they use marijuana to relax themselves or to even come off of opiate addiction. I see a lot of cases of medical marijuana holders who smoke marijuana, who are former methamphetamine or heroin addicts, that they became heroin addicts or meth addicts because of medication that they were taking. Doctors, we hear it on the news every day, over prescribing opiates, killing people. So I don't, even though it technically can fall under the DSM, I don't consider smoking pot as a substance abuse disorder, because a lot of people use it as a scapegoat. But there's many outlets in the world nowadays, from your work life to family life to social life, that can feed into these addictions. And having some underlying psychological condition probably doesn't help.
Yeah, it's just a big old mess. Just one thing
Yeah.
cycling off the other.
Yeah, and it's easy to fall in the slip. I look at a lot of alcoholics. Some of them became alcoholics when they were our age. And that's because they think they're young and bulletproof and they can go out and drink $200-300 a night at the bar. And once they realize, oh, okay, it's easier just to go down to the liquor store, spend $20, get an 18 pack, and I could be blitzed out of my mind for the rest of the night. That's what they do. Um, that's why, like, when people say, oh, I like to have a beer after work. Why? Because if you start getting in the cycle where your body's used to having a beer 5 days a
Right
week,
after work, yeah.
what's to stop you from having 2 beers after work? What's to stop it from getting worse and worse and worse as time progresses? And a lot of people don't go, oh, I can keep it under control. They initially, it never got to that point. Well, just because it hasn't doesn't mean it will.
Exactly.
You know, we see that in like cocaine addicts and heroin addicts as well, with pain meds. Oh, I take it to make my back feel better. Well, what's to stop you from shooting up heroin? You know what I mean? Because it's pretty much the same chemical compound, just different in certain aspects. So I don't know. Me personally, like, yeah, I had my partying 20s. I don't drink anymore, period. I don't, touch pot or anything like that. I'm basically, my only vice is nicotine and a lot of caffeine, but
Yeah, I
um
there.
but like I don't fault people for like saying, oh, Dave, I like to smoke pot. Cool, because back in the 90s, I mean, you probably remember this as much as I do. Oh, hey, pot's a gateway drug. If you start smoking pot, next thing you know, you're going to be smoking crack.
Hmm.
How many people do you know who start smoking pot and then start smoking crack? It's very limited.
A very good friend of mine, she smokes and she smoked since she was probably like 16 or 17, and she rarely drinks, and she will not touch anything else. Like, it doesn't matter how much you try and
Mhm.
explain this is a good thing or this will be fun. She refuses to touch other drugs. Or, I mean, I don't even really necessarily consider marijuana a drug. I consider it more so a medication, especially since they came out with the whole medical marijuana.
Right.
But
Well, that's because people are really looking at it now as like, can we use this pharmaceutically? And they're starting to see more and more cases of, yes, this has a lot of pharmacological components that helps people. There's a research institute out in California. It might not be California, it might be Washington. It's out west. And they are studying psilocybin. You know what psilocybin is, right? Okay, some people don't know. It's the chemical in magic mushrooms that causes the hallucinations. They're testing it to relieve anxiety in terminally ill patients. And it's shown, the data shows that people who have guided psilocybin journeys when they're at end stage cancer actually suffer less when the time comes to them to succumb to the cancer than if they weren't on it.
that's amazing.
Why aren't we using that?
Yeah, right. Especially with people that are terminal, like what else are they gonna do?
Well, yeah, and that could also alleviate, there's been discussion lately about like euthanasia. That could alleviate some of the need for that. People are just so anxious about, oh, I don't know when I'm going to die. I don't know when I'm going to die. So I'm going to choose when I die. That could also help that. I don't know if there's any studies into that, but I know that it relieves that stress and anxiety after the patient knows that they are going to succumb to this illness. Also, there's been some correlative links to people who have these disorders and they're going through the stress, not necessarily terminal, but like cancer, or they were doing a study, I think in 2020, it might have been 2019, but I'm not entirely sure, where they were using it with people who had HIV/AIDS that were really sick from that, and they were suffering from the stress of it. Use psilocybin guided journey. So by that, I mean, they would give them 35 milligrams of psilocybin, sit them down next to somebody who is trained to deal with somebody who's going through these hallucinations. And at the end of it, they were stress-free for the most part. Their anxiety and stress was reduced, and it helped them really refocus their life. Honestly, I think they should really look into that. I think Big Pharma honestly needs to dig their head out of whatever hole they're in and say, okay, these may have some municipal purposes. Crystal meth? No. Psilocybin? Probably.
Yeah, exactly. Definitely not crystal meth.
Yeah, no. Because you see crystal meth cats, running up and down the street naked, and like that bath salts guy that wound up eating that dude in Florida.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Yeah, you remember that case? People were like, "Oh, that the zombie apocalypse is real." No, that dude was just
exactly. It's just drugs. It's just drugs. Calm down.
Yeah. Well, when I was in the Army, we were doing a briefing about drugs, and the instructor that we have, it was a sergeant that I'm still pretty good friends with. He goes, "This drug," and he flicks the clicker, and it pops up a picture of bath salts. He goes, "We'll make you eat people. Don't touch it." And then he just moved on. I was like, that's, I mean, he's right.
That's too funny. Great conversation so far. I'm loving it.
We're talking about zombies.
Yeah, zombies. Zombies.
This is Zombie Jesus Day, too.
I'll have to talk about zombies on every podcast now. It just makes things a little bit more interesting.
Absolutely.
Everybody likes zombies, except for when they're eating your face.
Yeah, just remember, aim for the head, folks. Aim for the head.
Okay, so now that we've talked about, like you said, psychopathy, mental health disorders, and addiction, let's kind of go into the cycle of abuse. And maybe like I was going to ask you earlier, is narcissistic personality disorder actually something that's in the DSM-5, or is that okay? Could you explain a little bit more about narcissistic personality disorder to those who don't know what it is?
Absolutely. This is actually, to me, as somebody who's psych trained, a pretty interesting disorder, because you see it a lot in people in your life. So narcissistic personality disorder simply has to do, it's not like, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, stuff like that. It doesn't have a genetic component. It doesn't have the difference in neurotransmitters. It is just a personality disorder. It is how people are raised and formed by their environment. And somebody who's a narcissist is usually somebody who gets all the attention when they're a kid. So they feel the attention has to be about them as adults. So they get older and they start having these grandiose opinions of themselves. A really good thing that I want to point out. I hear this term used a lot on the internet, and this honestly makes me want to slap people. Narcissistic. That person's a narcissistic abuser. That person's a narcissistic abuser. The people that say that don't know what narcissism really is and have never really experienced it in their life, or they're a narcissist themselves. Because they think everybody's trying to abuse them using mental manipulation that a narcissist who has narcissistic personality disorder will employ. That's not the case. Some people are just self-centered. So that's my thing. That's my spiel about narcissism. So narcissism.
Every abuser is going to be a narcissist.
No. That's absolutely not true. Some people could just be paranoid. You know what I mean? Some people are just, a-holes. Some people will abuse themselves and will abuse others. So to link narcissism and abuse, I think is unfair, because there are some narcissists in the world that are not abusers. They're just manipulators. Now, granted, manipulation is a fact of abuse, but it's not that they manipulate solely people. They can manipulate how they look. The image people, for instance. That's the best way I like to describe a narcissist. They are worried about their self-image. That's narcissism. So a person with narcissism or narcissistic personality is somebody who has a grandiose opinion of themselves. The conversation has to be about them. The discussion has to be about them. They're the kind of cat that, if you're sitting at the dinner table and you're like, yeah, I just got a promotion at work. And so, your wife is like, oh yeah, by the way, I'm pregnant. They will come out and say, oh, by the way, I got into college. They have to make the conversation about them. They can't be happy for others because they're so worried about themselves. And they will even go through almost like physical distress because they are so worried about how they are and how people talk about them. Another real key example is the conversation with a narcissist is always about their personal achievements, and they will put down your achievements. So for instance, if me and you were conversating and I was the narcissist and you said, yesterday I got promoted at work, I got a pay raise, a normal person would go, oh, that's awesome. That's really good. Congratulations. You deserved it. You earned it. However they want to approach that, a neurotypical person will say that. Whereas a narcissist would be like, oh, you got a promotion at work? Well, I got promoted last week and you didn't care about that.
Yeah,
or
exactly.
I got promoted, so the way that I've got people like that in my life, I can tell you that. And it's really hard to navigate the conversation when you're dealing with a narcissist. So the way I like to do it is I like to interject a little bit of humor, a little Ron White humor into it. That when the person that I'm thinking of is like, oh yeah, I got this promotion at work and I'm this real big tough guy that is at work and everybody follows me. And I was like, yeah, well, one time I stuck my pecker in a toaster and it shuts them up because they don't know how to respond to it. They can't change it about them. Oh yeah, well, I flayed my junk with a kitchen knife. They can't really make it about them, so they have to kind of just laugh it off, and they're like, okay. And the conversation will end usually for a little bit, give you a little bit of a reprieve before having to deal with some more of the narcissism. So I say that a lot. I tell people, when you're dealing with a narcissist, just say something outrageous about you. Like, yeah, well, one time I got trapped in a dryer. How is that relevant?
And how would they come back to that? They'd have nothing to say back to that because there's...
Exactly. They can't make it about themselves. they can't make
you on something like that.
Yeah, because you can't, you can't really bring that conversation back to you. Now it's all on you because you said something completely outrageous. 2, you said something funny. Narcissists don't like when the conversation shifts in a funny way sometimes. So, tailor that to whatever narcissist you're dealing with. But I think when it comes to narcissism, the worst place for a narcissist to be is in the position of parent. Because then the kids, they suffer from that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or just from my work at probation alone, I know some narcissist parents, and these kids suffer because of it. Because it's like, yeah, hey, I got first place in my baseball tournament. Well, that's cool. When I was your age, I was, I built the ark and saved 2 of every animal.
Right.
Okay, then they feel insignificant as children, and they're the kind of kids that, you'll see them. You'll see them in the wild. They're the kids that don't take up too much space in the room. Usually they are the ones that are being raised by a narcissist, or maybe they're just timid, but more likely or not, they're narcissistic because they'll shrink like this in the room. They won't talk much. They don't really interact with the conversation because they're scared if they say, oh yeah, I played that Pokemon game. Their friend's going to be like, well, I own every one of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when I learned that tidbit, I started thinking about our high school days, and I'm sure you can relate. You just thinking about it, you can name 3 people from like school that were like that, and you're like, I wonder if their parents were narcissistic like that. They didn't take much pride in what their kids were doing in life.
Probably.
But that's not to say all of them. There's some kids that are raised by narcissists that made good things of themselves.
Yeah.
It all depends on in spite of or because of. There's a good section of the internet that always talks about victimhood mentality. And I kind of brushed it off as just people like, oh, well, I don't want to acknowledge that there's bad in the world, so I'm just going to say you're a perpetual victim. Until I started actually learning psych and interacting with psych patients, that is true to an extent. Some people would just make themselves the victim because, oh, well, I have PTSD and I can't work. Okay. Thousands of soldiers come home every week with PTSD and they still work. They deal with it. They suffer from this trauma. They seek the help that they need. They lean into it. And people with stress disorders, sometimes the stress disorder doesn't last 3 months. As long as there's active treatment involved, they can grow beyond what that stress disorder is. So, you start seeing that more and more and start going, yeah, okay, victimhood mentality. Some people are just perpetual victims. And it's sad that they use the world of psych as their crutch. But yeah, bringing it back to narcissism. Narcissists are not easy people to deal with, and they will manipulate you. And that could easily feed into abuse. Somebody who's a narcissist can easily become an abuser depending on how they channel said narcissism. In a relationship, think about it like this. If in a relationship, you're with somebody and you're out with your friends and and you made a comment, oh yeah, I cleaned the whole house, and then somebody came in and destroyed it. And that person goes, why are you talking like that? And then they get them to the side. Why would you tell your friends that? Why tell them that? Well, it's true. It's not a lie, but it doesn't also make you look bad. You could have just had a bad day. It was kind of something funny to break up the conversation. Don't talk about me like that to your friends. That's that manipulation coming in because they don't like their image being tarnished in any way. It could be something as minuscule as somebody has pimples on their back. Why do you tell them that?
Sometimes it's the littlest things that can set them off the most.
Yes. The easiest one is like financial stability. Narcissists like to paint themselves as like this BMW driving, big house owning, you know, people, but a lot of them are not that way, you know, because they have such an abrasive personality. It's really hard to make the kind of connections with people that would make them successful. So sometimes, you know, people who are narcissists, they're kind of delayed in the way they interact with the work life. So they may not be these rich people, but they like to portray themselves as this good, clean, honest, you know, either white collar, blue collar person who has, you know, like I'm sure you've seen it on Facebook, dirty hands equals clean money. Some people like that are honest, everyday Americans, just, you know, working paycheck to paycheck. But some of them could be narcissists because, you know, I earn my money. I'm good with my money, kind of image projection. And that comes, here's the thing is they could even abuse family members, you know. Watch a couple episodes of Judge Judy with family members, and you can tell if somebody's narcissistic because, you know, you could say, oh, well, you know, I went over to help grandma, and grandma was sitting in a dirty diaper all day because she's invalid. She can't walk. Don't tell her that. They don't need to know that. It's honest. You know what I mean? I always say that with narcissists, being honest is a secondary thought. It's always about what they project, what people assess of them. And that in an intimate partner situation, that could be detrimental. You know, it could be the dissolution of the relationship, or it could lead to severe mental, emotional abuse. I'm trying to think of the guy's name, but he was a famous case, I think in 2016, 2017. I may be wrong on the years, but he was dating, he was a famous MMA fighter, semi-famous, I should say. He was an MMA fighter, and he was dating a porn star. And he had issues with people talking about his sexual capability, essentially. And one night after the breakdown of the relationship and the girlfriend left the situation, he breaks into the house, beats the hell out of her, sexually assaults her. But the issue is he would ramp up the abuse towards her when he was having issues becoming erect. And that's narcissism. That is pure simplified narcissism, because he isn't this big, strong alpha male. I do alpha male things, therefore I'm rock hard all the time, anytime, and every fertile woman wants me. When you point that out, how does he respond? Instead of saying, oh, okay, maybe I have a problem. Maybe, you know, the years of steroid abuse has fried my capability to, you know, remain erect. So he beats the hell out of her and sexually assaults her. That you can see how that really can lead to that, you know, especially with somebody who is already unstable. If you read about his history, that dude was unstable from the word go. And you're talking about economic issues. So he was having issues as a fighter, getting jobs. He was having relationship issues. He was also having health issues. And it just culminated in this explosion, you know. Chris Watts is another case. I'm sure, are you familiar with the Chris Watts case? Mm-hmm. So Chris Watts is what we call in the psych realm a family killer because of who they are. He had to have been at some point in time very either intimately involved with or very close to a narcissist, because he was so introverted. He was so introverted. He was so passive. He was kind of like the secondary mentality. His wife kind of ran the show. And then one day he decides, I'm going to break out. And he's been married. He's got this really good job. He's living in this really nice house in Colorado. I mean, his wife was extremely gorgeous. She was a very lovely woman. He had 2 beautiful kids. And then one day he said, I'm going to break out. And he starts working out and starts dating this other girl on the side. And the wife finds out about it. He winds up killing her and the 2 kids to hide his shame, essentially, because he didn't want to look like a bad person. And because he didn't want to look like a bad person, he also lied to the cops. He lied to the media. You know, Chris Watts's case is pretty famous in the psych world because of the mentality of the family killer. But there's also added elements to it that would blow your mind, you know, sitting and watching his interrogation videos. He's so about his image. You know, he's so about, oh, my wife ran away with the 2 kids after I told her we were getting a divorce. It wasn't she initiated the divorce. It wasn't that he cheated. It was he just was tired of the relationship. And it took him how many years to finally admit that he wound up killing his wife and kids. That is sheer example of narcissism. Especially but that's the thing, is there was no indicators of abuse. None whatsoever. Until that happened. That's why, like I said, in psych, that's called a family killer. Because there's no signs that this is what's going to evolve into. You know, whereas with abuse, you can see it can ramp up every time. There was no sign. He just, I want a new life, and I don't want to look bad. I'm going to kill my wife and kids. So, narcissism is a dangerous thing, man. You know, I always just tell people, be humble. If you screw up, admit you screw up. If you can't admit you screwed up, you've got a problem.
Right. Big problem. Yeah. So now that we've gone through a little bit of that, we talked a little bit about narcissism, the difference between just being a narcissist and being a narcissistic abuser, which I know you don't like that term.
I hate that term. Like, you hear it so often. It's kind of like when we were kids and they're like, oh, that kid over there, he's acting strange. He must be autistic.
Yeah.
It's just disgusting. Because if that person has narcissistic personality disorder, they don't realize what they're doing is wrong.
Yeah.
So why just call everybody a narcissistic abuser? It's like, you know, another taboo word in psych. A lot of people who have bachelor or masters and PhDs in psych hate one word. Can you guess what it is?
Narcissist or abuser?
No. Retard.
Oh, well, yeah, I could see that.
It's just like that. It's becoming a taboo term. We don't want to call somebody a narcissistic abuser because all of these social media influencers from California are like, everybody's a narcissistic abuser, you know. Stop saying that crap.
There are some, but it's not all of them.
Yes, and if you're in a situation with somebody who is narcissistic and an abuser, you will know. Not everybody is. Some people just want to see you fail. Stop calling everybody a narcissistic abuser, you know. Maybe some people are just petty.
Yeah, that's very true. That's very true. So let's work our way in a little bit into the cycle of abuse, because I know that's something that would be very helpful for a lot of people to know and understand, because when you're in that cycle of abuse, you don't see it as that. And like you said, we can kind of talk a little bit more about that, and then maybe get into Stockholm Syndrome and how that relates to the cycle of abuse.
Absolutely. I mean, so the cycle of abuse theory has been around and it's heavily scrutinized, but as a general, it makes sense. You know what I mean? Because here's the thing: this model was designed for male on female intimate partner violence, and how to kind of help women get out of that situation. But what we're seeing now is a lot of same-sex couples are also exhibiting signs of the cycle of abuse.
Well as women abusing men also.
That is true, but that is actually statistically, you're more likely to get struck by lightning than to be abused by a woman. Usually in an intimate partner situation, it is the male. But yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. Women can be abusers as well. And we're seeing it a lot in same-sex couples. Actually, statistically, same-sex couples, two women, one of the women is more likely to be abused than a woman by a man by
Wow.
about 11%.
Wow. That's
So you're seeing it a lot more, with the ramp up of the LGBTQ population. You're seeing a lot of these intimate partner violence situations come out of, lesbian relationships. It's sad, but it could, nobody really knows where that abuse really comes from. It could just be psychological pressure, but the fact that we're seeing it more in women on women relationships does give credence to women can be abusers as well. There's been a lot of statistical data here lately in the last, I would say, 7 years, about you're more likely to be killed as a child by a single parent that is the mother than you are by the single parent that is the father.
We've seen that a lot on the news, and it happens a lot, unfortunately.
Yeah, and that's not to downplay the severity of men who abuse their children or men who abuse their significant others. My thing is a lot of people don't want to hear that. Because think about it like this. If you're in a relationship and you're abusing your partner, like for instance, if I was abusing my wife, people would be like, call the police, call this person, call this, get his ass in jail, get him in court, get out of that relationship. But if I were to go to, some of my buddies and say, man, my wife came upstairs last night and just beat the hell out of me with a shoe. Just came upstairs, was upset, hit me in the face with a shoe. People go, what'd you do to piss her off?
Yeah, they don't look at it as a form of an abuse.
Instead of, whereas if a young lady was like, hey, my boyfriend smacked me in the face with a shoe. That's violence. That's intimate partner violence. Why can't the same prognosis be made on the opposite spectrum? So going through the cycles of abuse, I like to say it's pretty general. It is really general. We have to kind of look at it and through that lens that this is for general just relationships, but it was built specifically for male on female violence. So there hasn't been a real strong working model that I know of, and I may be wrong, of intimate partner violence such as female on male or female on female or male on male. So just big disclaimer to that. And another big thing is this cycle also talks about sexual abuse of a female partner. So that I know a lot of people are very sensitive to that topic. So, this would probably be the part to skip when we get to that.
I'm definitely going to put some trigger warnings on the beginning of it just to make sure that it's a little bit more comfortable for certain people.
Yeah, so because once you get into, once we get into the types of abuse, that's where it'll be discussed. So, just forewarning. But usually in this model, this is how it begins. It all begins in stage 1, and that's called the tension building stage. This is where the abuser versus the abused. So that's just how I'm going to describe it. I'm not going to say the man versus the woman. I'm going to say abuser versus the abused. The abuser begins to suffer from some sort of stressor. This could be a host of things, but the most common that we see is some sort of breakdown or disagreement in the family dynamic, issues with extended family. So, dad's sick, so I'm upset, or, mom's sick, so I'm upset. Work troubles. Work troubles is one of the most common. I mean, we've heard about that since the 50s of the stereotypical nuclear family. The dad comes home and backhands the wife because I had a bad day at the office, So work is the most commonly known. But one that is kind of overlooked, especially in this model, is physical and mental health. That person could be suffering from that tension building from an ailment that they're having. If you have, I don't know, pneumonia or something like that, and you're having a lot of health complications, or, in recent days, like COVID, you're having a lot of stress from that. That could be a tension building focal point. Their mental health could be a big tension building focal point as well, because you have some of these guys, some of these gals that are out there, and they get easily riled up by about, anything. And that's because they may be paranoid. They may have schizophrenia. They just are paranoid. So that tension takes a lot of time to build. It could easily, be a week, it could be 2 weeks, could be 3 weeks, could be a month, could be a year. And then that's when the transition happens to stage 2. Stage 2 is the incident of abuse. Now, the incident of abuse could be the initial, or it could be the continuation of the abuse in the cycle. And that is where the abuse manifests. That's where, you get the beatings or whatever the case may be. So the abuser can employ a bunch of different types of abuse. Now, like I said before, this is going to be a trigger warning, because one of those types of abuse is sexual abuse. They could come home after having all this tension built, they're having issues at work, they hit the bar or something like that. They come home and in an inebriated state with all this tension built up, decide, you know what, we're having sex. There is no ands, ifs, or buttholes about it. We're having sex. If she says no, too bad. I'm going to have it. And they go in and abuse them. Now, with women, on the opposite end, if it was a male that is the abused, it could be something as simple as extremely unwanted sexual advances. Like she comes home and walks up to him and just, hey, I want to have sex. No, I'm not feeling it tonight. She just kind of grabs him by the package. You know what I mean? That could also be a form of sexual abuse. And usually this instance of abuse is one and done. It's that happens, and then they immediately start shifting into the third phase. Whereas somebody who is physically, mentally, emotionally abusive, this could be for a period of time. You can see abusers do it, and they can employ mental abuse and physical abuse. They can employ emotional abuse and physical abuse. They could come home and say, you're a worthless piece of trash. Your parents didn't even love you. If they loved you, they'd be living here with us and they'd be taking care of you. And that's why I hit you, because you're always talking about your family. Or, you're crying all the time. That's why I hit you. They can use that in many, many forms. And we all can see it in somebody that we know that's been in an abusive relationship. I'm sure you can even relate to that as well.
Very much.
So, yeah. One that is very common, especially in predominantly physically abusive households, or relationships, I should say, is property destruction. How many times has we heard, they start destroying everything in the house and then they take their aggression out on the person.
Yep.
People always on the internet is like, oh, I'd rather punch a hole in the wall than punch my wife. Well, guess what? That's still a form of abuse, because you're saying, look how strong I am. I can destroy this wall. I'm He-Man. I can destroy this wall. That is a form of manipulation. You're trying to manipulate the person's behavior.
It's a scare tactic.
Exactly. It's pure manipulation on the face of it. So usually when people are like, when I get frustrated with my wife, or I get frustrated with my husband, and I shatter plates, or I punch holes in walls, it's always like, no, that's not an acceptable pro-social way to vent that frustration or that tension. So you need to quit doing crap like that. Or the other thing is that right as after the abuse happens and they start shifting into the phase of reconciliation, the abuser 9 times out of 10 will start justifying their actions.
Yes.
Oh, you're such a bitch. I hit you in the mouth because you back talked me. You know what I
It's
mean?
your fault. It's always the other person's fault. That's a very big
Yep.
thing that, I mean, a lot of the things that you hear like in movies or whatever when they show abusers, like, it's all your fault. You're the one that did this. Sayings
You
like
make
that,
me
like,
hate you.
you made me hate you. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. A lot of those sayings, it it's so textbook that it happens with, like, I mean, I can tell you it happened to me. Almost every friend that I know that was abused has told me the same exact verbiage
Yeah.
has happened with their situation. So I mean, the cycle of abuse really is very textbook, and it shows up exactly like that in these relationships.
Yeah. And going back to the relationship of abuse I was telling you about, the guy's name was War Machine. That was his fighting name. And one of the things that he did in that instance of abuse that was recorded, that what sent him to prison, was during the sexual assault, he's manipulating the way she thinks by what he's saying and what he's doing. He would make her repeat through the entire sexual assault, this is mine. This is he'd make her say, this is War Machine's expletive for a woman's vagina. This is yours, blah blah blah, throughout the entire sexual assault. And if she didn't recite it exactly how he wanted her to say it, he would hit her. That is a form of manipulation, because you're trying to pound that into somebody's head physically. So it could be something like that too, where you're with an intimate partner and you abuse them, and during the abuse you're like, well, you're mine, you're my property, I can do with you as I wish, is kind of that mental breakdown using a physical and manipulative component. So when people say, oh, he just hits me, it's never just hitting.
Yes.
It's never, he raped me. It's never just the rape. There's always an added component that makes the cycle of abuse so solidifying in that relationship. That's why whenever there's an instance of abuse, you have to leave that situation, because with the next stage, with reconciliation, it puts a lot of psychological pressure on people. It's very prevalent in young women that will be susceptible to that psychological pressure. Now, that's not to say men aren't that way. Some men are very susceptible. I mean, how many criminals do you know that give up everything in the first interrogation? There's a lot.
Man.
Guys are just stupid sometimes. But women usually are the ones that are like, okay, yeah, I can change him. I can fix him. And that's why I said earlier, don't assume that you can just fix somebody. You can't. If they are going to go through the cycle of abuse, you can't fix them. You'll never fix them. They have to fix themselves.
Somebody like you who sees this type of thing all the time, like, as a fact that you can't fix people like that.
No, especially in domestic violence cases. A lot of people in domestic violence cases, the partner that was the abused is always like, I thought I could fix him. I thought he would change. I thought that once he saw what he was doing to me, it would change his opinion. But usually somebody who is an abuser like this, they don't care. They don't see you as a person. They don't humanize you. That's why they can so easily go from this tension building to this abuse phase, because they don't see you as a person. It's harder to rip somebody up if they're a person to you versus if they see you as an object, as like a cardboard box. You know what I mean? That's why in any healthy relationship, any healthy marriage, there's always that aspect of humanization. God, my English sucks today. And you have to humanize the person, because if ever the situation comes where you have suffered from the tension building phase and you're going to vent it out, you don't take it out on that partner. You could be like, you know what? I'm pissed off. I don't want to talk to you right now. Just leave the room. Let me sulk. We'll talk about it later. That's probably the healthiest way to deal with it. Some people, will pick up sports. I know people who, when they are extremely upset with their spouse, they'll go and play, baseball, football, golf, darts, something
Mhm.
to vent that frustration out in a pro-social behavior. And that's the key focus, is venting that frustration out in something else versus taking it out on the partner in which you're with. And that's what fuels the cycle of abuse. That's because the abused always in stage 3 thinks we can work this out. We can make it better. So that kind of segues into stage 3, which is reconciliation. So usually after that tension is built and that incident of abuse happens, that tension fades. It's just like anything else. When you're pissed off and you go to the gym and you hit the punching bag, after you hit that punching bag, get all that anger and that aggressive feeling out, and you're replaying that instance in your head, you relax, you feel better. The abuser then, once they kind of have that clarity, oh, what I did shouldn't have happened. I shouldn't have done that. And they may even use those phrases. I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have hit you like that. I shouldn't have abused you in that way. They are quick to move past it. They want to bury it, move on. Past is the past. No, never the case with abusers. And they will start showing affection. They will start showing understanding. They will start showing the person genuine feelings of reciprocation of love. And this could come in the form of doing kind things for that person, buying them gifts, having these well thought out and planned romantic gestures. Tension builds. I beat the piss out of her. Now we're in Nashville for the weekend because I feel bad. And, she's got the bed covered in roses and I got champagne and chocolates. We're going to have us a lovely night. They try to do that. And in anybody who's dealt with a domestic violence case, we call that the honeymoon phase of the cycle of abuse, because they think everything's new. This person's turned over a new leaf. I've done whatever I can to change them. And because I've done that, they're a new person. They're reborn. They're a phoenix from the ashes, as it were. That's never the case, because tension building comes pretty quick. It always does. And it in our lives every day, we suffer from tension. So it can come very quick. But even to break it down to even a molecular level, the person that is the abuse can start having these feelings of, oh, everything's perfect. Everything's great. I'm happy. Have that rush of dopamine and oxytocin, and they're just bonding. They always see it as bonding.
I like to call it.
Exactly.
Because it really is just like a smack in the face with love. I mean, they go over the top. I mean, in my situation, it would be like, it would go from the abuse to, oh, well, let's go to a party and I'll get you into the VIP and I'll buy you drinks and, we'll go out and we'll have a good time and I'll introduce you to all my friends and it's going to be great, or I'm going to buy you this, or I'll get you some chocolates. And I mean, they just go as far as possible. They try to be as romantic and as smooth talking as possible to get you to calm down and forget what they had done.
And the thing is they can also be almost chameleon-like in that aspect during that reconciliation phase, because they can easily go, trying to make that bond with somebody. For instance, let's say you like Disney and I, as role-playing as your abuser, don't like Disney. I hate Disney. You know what I mean? Like, burn Mickey Mouse at the stake, hate Disney. And I could go, you know what? I want to move past this abuse. I'm going to take you to Disneyland. Why the hell would I want to go to Disneyland for? For that reconciliation. And then next thing you know, they're walking out of the park eating one of those Star Wars churros with the Mickey Mouse hat on, talking about how they loved Snow White back in the day. They can easily blend to that because of that bonding. With that oxytocin, their brain is basically going, hey, guess what? You love this person, so you need to connect. You need to connect in any way possible. You don't like their music? Well, guess what? Today, you're a big fan of A Day to Remember. I never liked that band before, but today I do, you know, and it's almost chameleon. And this puts so much psychological pressure on the abused. It is absolutely insane how much psychological pressure this puts on the person, because then they start seeing themselves as, okay, yes, I am loved, I am appreciated, I'm taken care of, you know. But no more than, you know, maybe a day or week before, he beat the piss out of you. You were in the hospital, you know what I mean? Like, he sexually assaulted you, something that they did something so terrible to you, but because you have all this pressure placed on you, you kind of just forget it, and you're like, okay, yeah, you know, we're moved past it, and I'm appreciated, and I'm loved, and it'll never happen again. It's the biggest lie in the cycle of abuse. It'll never happen again. And that, after that, oxytocin starts to fade, that dopamine high you start coming down from that, you have a normal relationship again. It'll be normal. You'll go through your day-to-day life, and that normality in that situation is what we call the phase of calm, stage 4. Everything is normal. You are going through your day-to-day motions as a typical dating, engaged, married, whatever couple. This phase is the most dangerous of all the phases, I think. And this is my personal deduction, because this normality, people always seek that normality in every situation. I mean, look at what's happening in Ukraine right now, and everybody's talking about the people, the old lady walking around handing the seeds to the Russian soldiers. That's normal for anybody who's been associated with the USSR. They don't care about killing people. That phase is like the bear trap. It is the worst part, because you get trapped in that normality. You get complacent with that relationship. You've moved past that abuse. That abuse will never happen again. You trapped. That's where, you know, like we were talking earlier, that's where a person will start really developing the early stages of Stockholm syndrome. They've become trapped by their surroundings. Now, that isn't usually after the first instance of abuse. It's probably after the third or fourth instance of abuse. They're trapped. And in that trapping, you know, let's say you live in an apartment complex and you're on your 4th cycle of abuse. He beats the piss out of you, you're screaming and whatnot, and the cops get called. Cops go, what do you want to do? Do you want to press charges? No, this was this one-time thing. Or that argument got blown out of proportion, and I fell. And, you know, back in the 90s, the trope was, you know, a woman coming to work with a black eye. I fell. Now he beat the fuck out of you. That's what happened. And no, I fell. They start actually kind of saying, my abuser is a good person. It's just they have this one flaw in their personality. So I'm going to stay for the 90% that they give me and not the 10% that they give me. You know, you also see that in people who in the cycle of abuse, sometimes in the reconciliation phases, the abuser will even suggest, you know, maybe we should be polyamorous, you know, and the next thing you know, they're out cheating. So they say, oh, you know, I beat you last time because you were cheating. You know what I mean? Or I was cheating. Usually if someone accuses you of cheating, they're cheating. And it just traps people in that cycle. That's the hardest part when somebody is abused. If they are in the stage of calm, it is impossible to break them from it. Now, not to say that it can't happen. It's just really, really, really difficult to get somebody in that stage of calm who's in that normality to give up for a little bit of a chaotic breakup. You know what I mean? Or even they don't want to have a fight. And if this abuse goes on for a while, sometimes even the abuser will question their memory of the event. You know, the abuser would be like, I didn't hit you in the mouth. I hit you in the stomach.
Yeah.
And then you start going,
that makes any difference, but they do that.
Yeah. And it's like, oh, maybe he didn't hit me in the mouth. Maybe I did it. Or, you know, maybe she didn't crack me in the head with the frying pan. Maybe it was just a spatula. And they start doubting their memory. You know, in any circumstance when it comes to somebody who's abused, they are pretty bad historians in this phase. Really bad historians, because then they start questioning the abuse. And it's usually until they get out of that psychological pressure from the abuser that clarity starts coming back. Yeah, I remember he didn't hit me in the stomach. He hit me in the mouth. Yeah, I remember she didn't hit me with a spatula. She hit me with a damn frying pan. That memory will start to come back. Now, the one thing that I want to say is a lot of people have pointed out sometimes that phase of calm never happens. And that, whereas it's true, is not as common, but it can. It could easily go from tension building, abuse, reconciliation to tension building immediately. And it can happen so fast. That's where that Stockholm syndrome can come in. Even whereas before it would be reconciliation and calm, this time around, it could go from tension building, abuse to calm, or tension, abuse, reconciliation. That model's not, it has to go step by step by step by step, check on the box. It's very fluid. Especially in the more violent cases, the ones where the partner succumbs to the injuries, or the partner is so severely disfigured from the abuse that, they could easily have that last cycle be tension building, abuse, calm, tension building, abuse, calm. And it just gets worse. That violence will ramp up to where the partner isn't even reconciling sometimes. They just move past it. They just ignore it happened, and that'll be it. If you start seeing that pattern, that could be life ending for the abused. And that's the part that is the scariest. You know what I mean? Especially when their patterns start changing, is usually right where the abuse is going to culminate to something big.
Yeah.
And you don't want to be on the receiving end of that.
Yep, I've been on the receiving end of that, and it was not fun. It definitely, like you said, the stages did start to change, and there wasn't so much of that loving stage towards the end. It would just go straight back from that little bit of calmness to the tension building. And sometimes, instead of it going out over the course of a couple days to a week or a couple weeks, it could happen within a day. That cycle could happen. So,
and the abuse could get worse. You know what I mean? Whereas the abuser could just smack you in the face. The next day, it could be he punches you in the mouth, and then the day after that, it could be he punches you in the throat, and the day after that, it could get worse and worse and worse and worse. And
generally,
and that's where, when you actually know about the cycles of abuse, when you have intimate knowledge of the circumstance, you have a duty to that person to pull them out of that situation. Whatever it is, it doesn't matter if it's just mental abuse. You have a duty to that person, if you have any type of emotional connection to them, to pull them out of that situation and just shake them up. Look what you're doing to yourself. You're so much better than that. Look what he's doing to you. Look what she's doing to you. You need to get away from that person. If they're going to be abusive, they need to go be abusive to themselves. They need to quit being abusive to you. I don't know how many times I've heard of cases of intimate partner violence where somebody has intimate knowledge of it and doesn't do a damn thing. The bottom line is if a person does not step in, you're just as bad as the abuser.
Yeah,
think about it like
if you knew something, it may not make a difference with you today, but you can at least try.
Well, think about it. If you knew somebody was abusing their kid, like sexually abusing their kid, wouldn't you do something about it?
Oh, exactly. Definitely.
Then why won't you do that about somebody that is your friend?
Exactly.
Doesn't make any sense. You know what I mean? I don't give a damn. Like if I don't know the person and somebody came out to me and said, my partner's abusing me, I don't know what to do. You as a moralistic person would step in and say, look, that ain't right. You need to move on. You need to get out of that situation before it gets worse. Like I said, you could look up the case of War Machine and what was her name? Something Mac. She was a porn star. I can't remember her name. The abuse built over time to the point of where he beat her nearly to death. It was bad. So that needs to be a life lesson for people, especially, you know, if anybody who's listening that may feel that they're in that cycle of abuse, they need to be able to realize this is bad, and I'm being manipulated at the tail end of it just so I can be abused again.
So while we're on the topic of all of that, let's go a little bit into Stockholm Syndrome and why a lot of abused people end up staying in these relationships.
Well, you know, it's like I said before, with Stockholm Syndrome, it's kind of a universal psych term. It's not necessarily in the DSM, as it were. It is a mentality of things will get better. My captor or abuser is doing what's best for me. You know, we see it a lot in abduction cases than we do in abuse cases. In the abduction cases, especially of small children, after they've been away from the parent for a while, and the person that abducted them, there was a famous case where the young girl was abducted, I think at like 9 years old, and at some point she was always worried that the cops were going to show up because she had developed an emotional bond with one of her captors. So she was like, I don't want them to get in trouble. I just want to go home. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. You see that a lot with people who have been placed in these circumstances, and people who are in abusive relationships could do the same, you know, and it could be to the point of where they don't want to press charges. They don't want to get out of the relationship because it'll never be the same. That happened one time, or yeah, it happened a couple of times, but it wasn't that bad. At least he didn't, you know, stab me. That's not good either way. So that Stockholm Syndrome is really where the abused, or I'm going to use the abused as a catch-all, is really rooting for the person that's abusing them. And it's sickening to see somebody who's going through something like that start minimalizing through that Stockholm Syndrome. Oh, what happened wasn't that bad. It could have been worse. Hear that a lot. It could have been way worse than what it was. Even yelling to manipulate someone's behavior is bad. You know, we as human beings have the right to do whatever we are going to do without abuse. So, you know, Stockholm Syndrome is very dangerous in these situations. The War Machine and Christy Mack, that was her name. The War Machine and Christy Mack case. She even said that the abuse before the actual assault and her raid wasn't that bad. She said that even in court, it wasn't that bad. I didn't realize it was going to get this bad. It always gets that bad. And it's that glimmer of Stockholm Syndrome where they're like, it wasn't as bad as it could have been, but it eventually got to that point, and now I feel bad. That's when the victim starts, you know, actually really looking at the situation. Is like, yeah, that was pretty bad.
And the statistics show that it takes an average of 7 times for somebody to leave their abuser.
And that could be that, you know, that mentality. It could be worse. Or if I say something to this person and try to interject to break up this cycle of abuse, it's gonna get bad. It's gonna be worse. I've got nothing else. You know what I mean? Everybody's got resources. You know, it's not that hard for a woman, especially nowadays. You know, back in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, domestic violence was the hot button topic next to AIDS. So you can just about every town has a battered woman shelter. You know, like here in Central Illinois, for instance, you can go to the Peoria Diocese and get checked into the Esther House like that.
Yeah.
It's not that hard. There's some disparity, and this is kind of a sensitive point for me because I know some men who have been abused. There's no battered men's shelter. You know what I mean? That's unfortunately, and it's sad because you know, look at, like I said, with the LGBTQ population, there could be men that are being abused by their boyfriends and husbands, and They can't go to a battered woman shelter. Sorry, you don't have the genitalia. You got to go.
Yeah,
That's why,
that's something that needs to change.
yeah. And then my mentality is we just need to have domestic violence homes, period. People who are in these cycles of abuse need to have a safe place that they can go and be protected until they can break away from their abuser. It doesn't matter what they're packing between their legs. It just matters the abuse. That's the whole thing. And, you know, a lot of people, like, especially in my college days, I got ridiculed for that thought process because it's like, well, women are solely the abusers or the abused.
So not true. I mean,
Yeah.
I know 3 people off the top of my head, 3 men off the top of my head that were abused.
One of my best friends, who's a gay man, was abused by his boyfriend. And it resulted in him getting arrested because the guy was such a manipulator. He was so skilled at manipulating the situation. You know, as my mom used to say, falling in a bed of crap and coming out smelling like roses. That's just how a manipulator is. And if there was just a domestic violence home where they could go, he would have been in that situation. He would have been able to break it out pretty quick. You know, like I said before, you know, lesbian relationships are statistically higher for that intimate partner violence. So they've got a little bit of protection, but the gay men, for instance, they don't. That's just sad. I mean, there's a lot of stories of gay marriages where men and men are abusive to each other, and it results in them constantly cheating, sexual abuse. Sexual assault and physical assault is not very common amongst gay men. I don't know why. I think a lot of it has to do with they still have a very humanizing look at their partner. So you don't see a lot of physical abuse in men on men relationships. So it's real sad. You know what I mean? Like, especially people who are abused, they sometimes don't even realize what kind of resources they have at their fingertips.
Oh yeah, I mean, I knew for some, I knew a little bit, like I knew that there was a place I could probably go, but at the same time, I was always scared of calling the police because I didn't want him to manipulate things into where I would be the one in jail.
Right. And sometimes, you know what, that happens. You know, and my mentality about it, and I've said this before, if that happens and you wind up in jail, guess what? You're away from your abuser.
Exactly. That happened with my best friends.
Yeah, take it, fight it in court, because at the end of the day, they may be able to manipulate cops. Look, you know, the current climate of cop reform is big right now. And the way they handle mental health cases and abuse cases has been wrong. Cops generally go into an abuse situation looking at, for instance, for a heterosexual couple, they will go into that abuse situation instantly there, not to prove the guilt of the man as the abuser, but there to look for the disproof. Mm-hmm. So they assume naturally going into that circumstance that the male is the abuser. That's not all the time. I mean, you know, most of the time, yeah, absolutely. But all the time, no. So, you know, sometimes cops, you know, like I said, I know a lot of fantastic cops, but sometimes when they go into these circumstances, these high charge circumstances, they act stupid and they put the wrong people in jail. If that ever happens, you know what? I just, like I said, I see it as I'm away from the abuser. I'll win in court. That manipulation, they may be able to manipulate the cop because in that instance, the cop was stupid. But they're not going to manipulate a judge and a neutral arbiter of the truth. And a lot of judges will see through that pretty quickly. Oh, why is this person in front of me? And guess what? Most states, if you get confined unjustly, they pay you money. So you're getting paid money to get away from your abuser. Take it. Yeah. You get 3 hots in the pot, you're away from your abuser, and you can prove it in court. I wasn't the abuser. They were the abuser. Cop was stupid. And if a lot of people did that, I think it would bring a lot of reform to the criminal justice aspect, you know?
I completely agree with you. and make a whole hell of a lot of a difference.
Yeah, but people see jail as like, if I go to jail, my life's over.
Mm-hmm.
Your life's not over.
If you go to
I know.
prison, maybe, but jail is a little bit different.
Yeah. If you go to DOC on a felony charge, yeah, you're going to have a hard time when you get out. That's not to say your life's over. There's a lot of people who get felony charges, get out, make something great of themselves. It's all about what you do with it, the way you look at things. And there's always this weird stigma around the mental health of people, around abusers. You know, there's a lot of stigma around abusers. And with substance users, there's stigma. Oh, he's a crackhead. Ain't nobody want to deal with a crackhead. No, you need to get that cat some help. You know what I mean? Like, that's always been my mentality. If somebody came to me and said, I'm addicted to substances, I can name 3 resources off the top of my head right now that would get them the help that they need. A lot of people can't do that. You know, you never know. Your kid may one day become an addict. How would you know to deal with that situation? You wouldn't. You know, life lessons to be learned, I guess.
Very true. Very true. Well, I think that would be about all that we had in time for our conversation today. I really enjoyed this conversation. You learned a whole lot. Well, I did.
Well,
At least.
I was about to say these are topics that it may be kind of sadistic to say it this way, but these are topics that I enjoy because I've always been interested in how the mind works, you know.
Me too.
So, you know, these topics, as nasty as they are, as gritty as they are something that's always been fascinating to me. So, you know, and like I said, learn. Take the time to learn about stuff like this, and you'll be able to spot it a lot better.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need a 4-year degree to be able to see stuff like this.
Yeah, you just got to open your eyes a little bit and look around you. That's all.
Yep.
Very true. Well, it was very wonderful to have you as a guest on our show today. I'm sure that our listeners will enjoy all of your input, and hopefully we can have you back again someday.
Absolutely. Just let me know.
Alrighty. Thanks for being on the show. You have a great day. Well, I hope you really enjoyed our show today. I think we had an amazing conversation, and I really learned a whole lot. Please join us again next time, and make sure to rate, review, and like us on whatever platform you are listening or watching this on. I really enjoyed having all of you watching here today. Have a great day.